The opening statement tonight is pretty serious because of obviously the world events that we're watching around us, which is the real reason that you're hearing people outside chanting genocidal slogans like "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free," which is in fact a genocidal slogan. The river they're talking about is the Jordan River. The sea they're talking about is the Mediterranean Sea. The real question is why that has become such a common sentiment in the West. Why it is that this has become such a common sentiment that you see 100,000 people marching in the streets of London in a pro-Hamas rally. Or why it is you see widespread sentiment honeycombed throughout American universities and universities throughout the West in favor of Hamas after Hamas committed the worst pogrom against Jews since the Holocaust. And let me be extremely clear about this. I brought some visual aids for those people who don't actually believe what is eminently true, which is that Hamas is not the same as the West. Hamas is not morally equivalent to Israel. If you don't believe me, this is what Hamas is. This is what Hamas is. Hamas is murdered babies burned in their cribs. What Hamas is Shani Luke. Shani Luke's body her head was found today, her skull was found today. She's a young woman, she's 22 years old, and she was murdered by Hamas and taken back to the Gaza Strip where she was put in the back of a truck. Anyone who draws moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel, between Hamas and the Jews, is a Jew hater, full stop, end of story. So the question is, why exactly that's become such a common sentiment in the West? And the answer is because the West is ashamed of its own values. In fact, what the West really is ashamed of the superiority of its own values. Not everybody thinks the same way. Not everybody thinks the same way. Now, there are plenty of political disagreements to be had on all sides. There are plenty of disagreements to be had with regard to a two-state solution. But there is no disagreement to be had between the values of Hamas and the people who support Hamas and the values of the state of Israel or the values of the West. Anybody who equates those values is making a serious category error. The West has become shy about its own principles. The West has become humiliated by its own principles and instead has decided to substitute an idiotic notion that everybody thinks the same way, and it's not true. And because the West thinks that, the West falls into these category errors where they believe you can buy off terrorist groups like Hamas, where they believe that Hamas's actual goal is not what they say. Hamas openly says their goal is to exterminate all Jews, but we can't believe them because we're so paternalistic that we believe that we don't believe them. It must be economic discontent. It must be a land dispute. Or maybe it turns out that people who burn babies in their cribs, who rape mothers in front of their children and then murder both of them, maybe they don't think like you. Maybe they don't think like me. Maybe these are people who have a different worldview, and that worldview cannot be combated by pretending it away with morally relativistic bullshit. Maybe that is what we are watching in the West. And so what the West actually has to do is start to have a little bit more respect for its own values. And back in 1933, this union voted in humiliating fashion the so-called Oxford Oath that they would not defend king and country. And that was used by people like Hitler, like Mussolini, to believe that the West was weak. Any civilization that will not defend its own values, any civilization that creates an equation between its own values and the values of groups like Hamas is weak. And that is not something the West can afford. Now, 6 million Jews died in camps and died in ditches waiting for the West to discover that its values were superior to the values of the Nazis. The state of Israel exists so that the Jews don't have to wait anymore, and thank God for that. But this is not about Israel for the West. What it is about is whether the West is going to defend values that actually matter. It's about whether the West is going to recognize once and for all that its values are not the same as those of groups like Hamas, that not everything can be talked out in negotiations in a room, that the people who would do the sorts of things that we saw on October 7th are not morally equivalent to people who try to target those terrorists, who are trying to kill those terrorists, while the terrorists themselves are bragging about putting civilians atop their rockets. Okay, any moral equivalence that's drawn in this conflict by the people who are chanting outside should be treated as evidence of anti-Semitism because there has never been a clearer moral contrast than what we are seeing right now. There's been a lot of talk about the two-state solution, about the Israeli-Arab conflict over the course of decades. That's obviously going to continue. But if you cannot take sides between what we saw on October 7th and what we see in Hamas and what Israel is doing in response, you have lost all moral credibility.